Think about the most dangerous person in the Seven Kingdoms for a second. Not the most dangerous fighter, not the most powerful warlord, the most dangerous person. The one who, if they decided you were a problem, you were finished. Most people watching this story assume that answer involves dragons, or an army, or a throne. But there's a case to be made, a genuinely strong one, that the single most dangerous person in the entire political landscape of Westeros spent most of his life being treated as a joke, and his name is Tyrion Lannister.
Thank the gods. I haven't had a proper shit in 6 days.
The Lannister he wasn't supposed to be. To understand what Tyrion was working against from the very beginning, you have to understand what the Lannister name actually meant. Not just in the show, but across the entire deep history of this world. House Lannister traces its founding legend back to a figure called Lan the Clever, a trickster from the Age of Heroes who, according to the oldest stories, took the fortress of Casterly Rock from its original owners without a single drop of blood, through nothing but manipulation and wit. That founding story shaped everything the family believed about itself for thousands of years. That Lannisters win through cleverness, through gold, through leverage, not through brute strength. And yet, ironically, by the time Tywin Lannister is running the family in the main story, the version of Lannister power being projected to the world is almost entirely built on fear and force, the reputation for doing whatever it takes to destroy enemies completely, the gold that funds armies, the willingness to cross lines other houses won't. Tywin had spent his entire adult life repairing a family reputation his own father had let collapse, and the tool he used to do that was ruthlessness.
My children, you disgraced the Lannister name for far too long.
Applied consistently and without apology. Into that family, Cersei Lannister was born first. Sharp, politically aware, furious at the limitations placed on her because of her gender. Then Jaime, golden-haired, physically gifted, the knight Tywin actually wanted to be his legacy. And then Tyrion. Born smaller than expected, born different. And his mother died in the process of giving birth to him, which Tywin never forgot and never forgave.
When have you ever done something that wasn't in your interest, but solely for the benefit of the family?
The day that you were born.
From that moment, Tyrion's position in the family was defined not by what he did, but by what he represented to his father. An embarrassment, a failure of nature, a thing that cost Tywin the one person he ever truly loved. There was no achievement that would fix that in Tywin's eyes. No victory, no political success, no demonstration of intelligence would ever fully close that gap. Tyrion spent his entire life trying anyway, and understanding that dynamic is the key to understanding almost every major decision he ever made. What makes it genuinely fascinating is how that impossible position ended up being the thing that sharpened him. Children who grow up with every door open to them don't need to find ways around locked ones. Tyrion grew up with almost every conventional path to power closed off. He couldn't lead armies the way Tywin expected of Lannister men, couldn't marry into strength, couldn't intimidate anyone through physical presence, so he did the only thing available to him. He read, he observed, he listened. He learned how every room he walked into actually worked beneath its surface because he had no alternative. That's not a small thing. That's the foundation of everything else this list is going to cover. But before we get to his greatest moments, we need to spend some time on the person who shaped him before any of those moments happened. And it wasn't Tywin. What books and brothels actually taught him. This sounds like a joke, and it isn't. Tyrion's two great early educations, obsessive reading and spending time in places the rest of his family considered beneath them, turned out to produce something neither of those things usually produce on their own.
You're not thinking of taking the black?
And go celibate? The whores would go begging from dawn to Casterly Rock.
The reading part is straightforward enough. Tyrion devoured everything available to him in Casterly Rock's library. History, military strategy, accounts of past sieges and campaigns and political collapses. By the time he's an adult, his knowledge of Westerosi history is almost unmatched among the noble class, most of whom had the same access and couldn't be bothered. He memorized defensive layouts for castles, tactics used in battles fought centuries before he was born, the specific conditions that had caused previous dynasties to collapse from within. He wasn't collecting trivia, he was building a toolkit. But the brothels taught him something books couldn't. And this is the part most analyses of Tyrion skip past too quickly. Spending time in places where people are completely unguarded, where the social performances expected in noble courts completely disappear, gave Tyrion an unusually accurate picture of how people actually behaved when the mask came off. He understood desire, desperation, the things people wanted badly enough to do things that would horrify their families. That's genuinely useful political intelligence, arguably more useful than knowing which general used which formation at which battle. There's also the matter of Tysha, a girl Tyrion met when he was still young, the daughter of a common family, who he fell genuinely in love with and married in secret.
Her name was Tysha. She was a wheelwright's orphan, and she was hungry.
Jaime later told him the marriage was a lie, that Tysha had been paid to be with him, arranged to make Tyrion feel wanted. The revelation broke something in Tyrion that never fully healed, and Tywin made the entire situation as deliberately cruel as possible, reinforcing the message that Tyrion had no right to expect real love or real loyalty from anyone. What that experience left him with, underneath the wine and the jokes and the relentless deflection with wit, was a particular sensitivity to people who were treated as less than they were, to people used by those with more power. That sensitivity informed his politics in ways that separated him from almost every other major player in this story. None of that is visible on the surface when you first meet him, and that invisibility, it turned out, was one of his greatest assets. Because nobody feared him, and people who aren't feared are never fully watched. The hand nobody wanted. The position of Hand of the King has one of the stranger histories in Westeros. The role was effectively invented by Aegon the Conqueror himself, who needed someone to actually run the kingdom while he focused on consolidating military control, meaning the Hand, from the very beginning, was the person actually governing while the king held the symbolic weight. Some of the most consequential figures in Westerosi history held that position. Some of the most catastrophic collapses of royal authority happened because of hands who either grabbed too much power or failed completely at managing the ones above them. When Tywin sent Tyrion to King's Landing to serve as acting Hand of the King during Joffrey's reign, this wasn't an honor, it was a management decision.
Rule. You will serve as Hand of the King in my stead.
Joffrey had already had Ned Stark executed against everyone's advice, destabilizing the entire political situation at exactly the wrong moment, and the realm was actively fracturing into civil war.
Shall never go unpunished. Sir Ilyn, bring me his head.
Tywin couldn't leave the battlefield himself, so he sent the family member he considered most expendable, the one he could lose without it costing him anything he actually valued, to manage a crisis that was rapidly getting out of control. Tyrion arrived in King's Landing with no real authority, no loyal army, and a court full of people who either despised him, feared what he represented, or were actively working against Lannister interests while pretending not to be. Cersei resented him immediately and explicitly. The small council was full of people playing their own games. Varys collecting information for purposes nobody fully understood, Peter Baelish redirecting money from the crown's treasury into his own operations, Pycelle loyal to whoever seemed most likely to protect him personally. The thing Tyrion did in that environment that almost nobody gives him proper credit for was methodical. He didn't walk in and try to dominate through force. He walked in, listened, watched, and then spent weeks quietly testing each member of the small council with false information, telling each of them a different story about a proposed marriage alliance, then watching which version made it back to Cersei.
I'm brokering an alliance with House Martell of Dorne. I plan to marry Princess Marcella off to Theon Greyjoy. I plan to wed Princess Marcella to Robin Arryn of the Vale, the Starks, and will convince the boy to come to our side.
That test told him exactly who was reporting to his sister, and it told him something equally important, that he could use the same technique to feed deliberately misleading information to anyone he needed to misdirect. That's not a move you learn from combat training, that's a move you learn from reading about every political collapse in the last 300 years of Westerosi history and noticing the pattern in how they all started, with a room full of advisors who were loyal to themselves first and their supposed master second. He also did something that had almost no precedent in the history of King's Landing. He deliberately made himself visible to the city's poor. He personally intervened when Joffrey was being pelted with food by a starving crowd, an incident that Joffrey responded to by ordering his guards to attack the mob, a response that would have turned a food riot into something considerably worse.
war you started.
You're talking to a king!
And now I've struck a king. Did my hand fall from my wrist?
Tyrion countermanded the order in front of everyone, including Joffrey's own Kingsguard, and got the king off the street. It wasn't a popular move with Joffrey, it was the right move for the city, and it was the kind of move that required someone in the room who was capable of thinking past the next 5 minutes, which in that particular court was a rarer quality than it should have been. He also moved against Janos Slynt, the commander of the City Watch, the man who had personally betrayed Ned Stark and handed King's Landing to the Lannisters during Robert's death. Slynt was dangerous precisely because he had already proven he was willing to change allegiances for the right price, which meant he was as much a liability inside Lannister control as he'd been outside it.
I'm not questioning your honor, Lord Janos. I'm denying its existence.
Do you think I'll stand here?
Tyrion had him sent to the wall in the middle of the night, replaced with Bronn, a sellsword with no political allegiances and complete loyalty to whoever was paying him. Which at that point was Tyrion personally, quietly removing a compromised piece from the board and replacing it with a reliable one without anyone having a chance to object. That's the kind of move most people only recognize in hindsight. The Blackwater. Here's where things get genuinely impressive, because the Battle of the Blackwater is the one moment in the entire story where Tyrion operated as a military commander, and he did it against a fleet and army led by Stannis Baratheon, one of the most disciplined and experienced military minds in all of Westeros. The numbers were almost entirely in Stannis' favor. He had a larger fleet, a larger army, and was attacking a city whose ruler, Joffrey, inspired exactly zero loyalty in the people being asked to defend it. The Gold Cloaks, King's Landing City Watch, were not an elite fighting force. The city itself was full of a population that had been rioting over food shortages just weeks earlier. On paper, this was not a defensible situation. What Tyrion had was wildfire, a substance produced by the Alchemist Guild, a legacy of an earlier age of Westerosi history when the Targaryens had used it as a supplement to dragonfire before the dragons died out. Wildfire burns on water. It burns through almost anything. It cannot be easily extinguished.
The substance burns so hot, it melts wood, stone, even steel. And, of course, flesh.
And Tyrion found stores of it that had been sitting in vaults beneath the city for years, enough to make a plan that didn't require numerical superiority at all. He had a single ship loaded with wildfire sent into the mouth of the Blackwater Bay, allowed Stannis' fleet to bottleneck in the narrow passage chasing it, and then ignited the entire thing with a single fire arrow. The resulting explosion took out a massive portion of Stannis' fleet before a single soldier had set foot on the beach. What followed was brutal close combat at the city's walls, and Tyrion personally led a sortie out of a side gate, knowing full well he was the least physically suited person in the army to be doing it, because the gold cloaks at the gate were on the verge of breaking, and someone in authority needed to be seen moving toward the enemy rather than away from them. He kept the city. He kept the battle from being over before it began. And then, in the immediate aftermath, with Stannis' army broken and Tywin riding in to take credit for the victory, Tyrion woke up in a bed with a slash across his face, stripped of his position as Hand, given no formal recognition for any of it, and quietly moved back into the shadows while his father accepted the gratitude of the court. That moment, being the reason something succeeded and then watching someone else absorb every consequence of that success, is actually one of the more historically familiar patterns in Westerosi political history. Hands of the king who saved kingdoms and were discarded afterward are not rare. What made Tyrion's version of it particularly sharp was that he saw it coming and couldn't stop it, because the person above him was his own father. The trial. If the Blackwater was Tyrion's highest point in King's Landing, the trial for Joffrey's death was the lowest.
You admit you poisoned the king?
No. Of that I'm innocent.
And it's worth spending real time here because what happened during those proceedings was more calculated than it first appeared, and the miscalculation at the end of it was one of the most consequential mistakes he ever made. Joffrey died at his own wedding feast, poisoned in full view of hundreds of guests. The two most obvious suspects, the people with the clearest opportunity to have administered the poison, were actually Olenna Tyrell and Peter Baelish, working together through Sansa Stark's hairnet without Sansa's knowledge. The poison was hidden in a stone on that net and slipped into Joffrey's cup during the chaos of the feast. None of that was known at the time. What was known was that Tyrion had publicly threatened Joffrey months earlier in the throne room.
Monsters are dangerous, and just now kings are dying like flies.
That Tyrion was the last person to hand Joffrey his wine cup. That Cersei despised Tyrion and now had the single most powerful charge possible to use against him. And that Tywin, who had already decided Tyrion needed to be removed from any position of political influence, saw the trial as the cleanest possible mechanism for doing it. The proceedings were a performance. Almost every witness who appeared had been coached, pressured, or outright paid, something Tyrion watched happening in real time, recognizing one by one that the verdict had already been determined before the first word of testimony was spoken. Meryn Trant, Cersei's own hand-picked accounts of events, and then the person whose appearance in that room genuinely broke something in Tyrion, Shae. The woman he had tried desperately to send away from King's Landing to protect her, who appeared as a witness and delivered a fabricated account of events so personally damaging that it's impossible to interpret as anything other than a calculated destruction. Up until that point, Tyrion had been conducting himself with controlled, almost cold patience. He knew what was happening. He was managing it. And then Shae spoke, and whatever calculation he'd been running collapsed, replaced by something much rawer. And he stood up and delivered the single most honest speech anyone had given in that courtroom, telling the assembled court exactly what he thought of them.
I wish I was the monster you think I am. I wish I had enough poison.
It was the right emotional response and the wrong strategic one. Demanding trial by combat was a gamble that required someone willing to fight for him against a crown champion who turned out to be Sir Gregor Clegane, one of the largest and most feared fighters in the entire realm. The champion Tyrion chose, Oberyn Martell, was skilled enough to nearly win, and chose to prioritize a confession over a clean kill, which cost him the fight at the final moment. Tyrion was sentenced to death. He escaped. He found Shae in his father's chambers. He found his father. And in the space of one night, everything that had been building, every year of being treated as worthless, every public humiliation, every strategic compromise he'd made in a service of a family that viewed him as an asset at best and a liability by default, ended in the most irreversible way possible.
I have always been your son.
From that point forward, Tyrion Lannister had no family to return to, no country to go back to, and nothing left to prove to any of the people he'd spent his entire life trying to earn something from. What Tyrion did next is one of the more underrated sequences in the entire show, because it wasn't dramatic and it didn't involve any kind of action. It was a man working through a catastrophic personal collapse in real time while simultaneously doing the most important intellectual work of his life, figuring out whether Daenerys Targaryen was actually someone worth following. He ended up in the custody of Jorah Mormont, who was transporting him to Meereen as a way of buying his way back into Daenerys' favor. The journey gave Tyrion time and a captive audience, and he spent it doing what he always did, observing, asking questions, building a picture of who this woman actually was and what she was actually trying to accomplish.
You said you were taking me to the Queen.
I am. Queen Daenerys Targaryen. She's the queen I serve.
What he concluded by the time he arrived was that Daenerys had something most of the other claimants to power in this story fundamentally lacked: a genuine ideology. She wasn't trying to retake Westeros because she wanted personal wealth or comfort. She believed with considerable consistency that the slaving economies of the eastern cities were a moral catastrophe and that she had both the ability and the obligation to end them. That belief made her unpredictable in some ways and completely consistent in others. And Tyrion recognized that an unpredictable person with a genuine moral framework was far easier to advise than an unpredictable person with no framework at all. He talked himself into the room. He made the case to Daenerys' Master of Whispers, Varys, and eventually to Daenerys herself that the experience he had, the knowledge of Westerosi politics, of how the great houses actually operated, of what it would actually take to land an army on that continent and not have it immediately consumed by enemies on all sides, was worth more to her than any sword. She made him her hand. The period Tyrion spent governing Meereen on Daenerys' behalf while she was absent is where the limits of pure political intelligence, operating without the right kind of backing, became genuinely visible, and it's one of the more honest parts of his story. He tried to broker a compromise with the slave masters of the surrounding cities, a gradual, managed transition away from the slaving economy rather than an immediate violent abolition. The reasoning was pragmatic. The slave cities had entire economic systems built around the practice, and simply declaring it illegal without offering any transition created the conditions for immediate violent backlash. He negotiated a 7-year timeline, believing the compromise would stabilize the region long enough for Daenerys to consolidate power.
Instead of abolishing slavery overnight, we will give you 7 years to end the practice.
The slave masters took the compromise as a sign of weakness and used the time to escalate their attacks anyway, funding an insurgent group within Meereen called the Sons of the Harpy that began a sustained campaign of targeted killings in the city streets. The deal failed. The city destabilized further, and when Daenerys returned to find her compromise in ruins and her city under attack from a naval fleet sent by the Masters, she was furious. Not just at the situation, but at the specific advice that had gotten her there. Tyrion's argument for the compromise wasn't wrong in principle. It failed because the slave masters never intended to honor it. They simply needed time to assemble a coordinated military response, and his deal gave them the cover to do exactly that. The gap between a correct strategic analysis and a correct prediction of how other people will behave is one of the more brutal lessons in political history, and Meereen taught it to him in the most direct way possible. What he did after was arguably more impressive than the compromise itself, because rather than defend the failed policy, he absorbed the criticism, updated his understanding of what he was dealing with, and redirected his energy toward the thing he actually could still influence, getting Daenerys to Westeros in a position strong enough to be worth something when she arrived. There's a version of Tyrion that, after Meereen, becomes more cautious, starts hedging every piece of advice, stops committing to anything that could be used against him. That version of him would have been useless to anyone. What actually happened was different. He doubled down on his core approach, understand the people in the room better than they understand themselves, and use that understanding to put them in positions where their own interests align with what you need them to do. He just stopped assuming that alignment would hold once he left the room.
The wheel. You're not the first person who's ever dreamt it.
That recalibration is what made the next chapter possible, because what came next required him to get people who had every reason not to trust each other into the same room and keep them there long enough to agree on something that mattered. The coalition nobody thought was possible. The single most underappreciated political achievement in the entire final stretch of the show is what Tyrion managed to build in the lead up to the war against the dead, because what he assembled had no business working and almost didn't. Convincing Daenerys to sail north, to pause her campaign for the Iron Throne to deal with an enemy most people in the South still didn't believe was real, that alone required a level of persuasion that most advisors simply wouldn't have attempted. It was the opposite of what every conventional political instinct said to do. You don't abandon your strategic momentum to fight someone else's war. Daenerys did it anyway, in large part because of Tyrion's argument that the kind of ruler she claimed to want to be was exactly the kind of ruler who had to put this above the throne. Then there was the meeting at the Dragon Pit, the attempt to get Cersei Lannister to agree to a ceasefire, to stand down her armies long enough for the living to fight the dead without also fighting each other. Getting Cersei to agree to anything required understanding her better than she understood herself, which Tyrion genuinely did. He went into that conversation knowing the one thing Cersei had left that still reached past her political calculation, the child she was carrying, and the idea that whatever she built might actually have someone to inherit it.
Get on a boat. Take those who matter.
You're pregnant.
He didn't use that manipulatively. He acknowledged it honestly, and Cersei, in the room, agreed to the ceasefire. She was lying. She had no intention of sending her armies north. But the conversation itself, and the temporary pause and hostilities it created, bought enough time and enough political space for the coalition at Winterfell to form and function. Whether Tyrion knew she was lying and played it anyway, or genuinely believed her, that's one of the more debated questions about his judgment in the final stretch. The last gamble. After the long night ended, after the Night King fell, Daenerys turned her attention south, and what followed at King's Landing is where everything Tyrion had warned about, quietly and then less quietly, came to pass. He had been watching Daenerys become more isolated for months. The advisors around her were gone, dead, or sidelined. The people who had tempered her decisions in the east, Jorah, Missandei, the council of her own council, were absent one by one. And without that friction, without anyone pushing back on her worst impulses, The version of her that emerged over King's Landing was not the version Tyrion had crossed the narrow sea to serve. He watched it happen. He made the decision to free Jaime and allow him to try to get Cersei out of the city before the attack, a decision that, when it was discovered, amounted to treason against his queen. Daenerys had him arrested, the city burned, and Tyrion sat in a cell watching the smoke rise, knowing that whatever came next, he had made an irreversible choice about which side of a line he was on.
But I believed in her with all my heart. Love is more powerful than reason. We all know that.
What he did from inside that cell, in some ways, the culmination of everything this video has been building toward, because it was the most purely political act of his entire life, and he did it with nothing. No title, no army, no family, no leverage of any kind. Just a brain that had been running this particular game for 30-something years. He talked Jon Snow into a decision Jon Snow didn't want to make, couldn't see a way to make, and ultimately made anyway. The conversation between them in that cell is worth sitting with, because Tyrion understood something about Jon that Jon didn't fully understand about himself. That Jon's entire identity was built around duty, around doing the thing that needed to be done even when it cost him everything, and that framing the situation in those terms was the only argument that could ever actually reach him.
You've always tried to do the right thing, no matter the cost. You've tried to protect people. Who is the greatest threat to the people now?
Tyrion didn't appeal to strategy, he didn't appeal to politics, he appealed to the one thing Jon Snow had never been able to refuse. It worked. And then he stood in front of the assembled lords of Westeros as a prisoner facing execution and made the case for Bran Stark as king, a case built not on who had the strongest bloodline or the biggest army, but on the idea that the person best suited to lead was the one who wanted it least and understood the most.
And who has a better story than Bran the Broken?
He argued that stories are the foundation of every kingdom, that the right story passed through generations is more durable than any army or dynasty, and that a man who carries the memory of 12,000 years of this continent's history in his head is the most qualified keeper of that story who has ever existed. It was also, and it's worth saying this plainly, the argument most likely to keep Tyrion himself alive. A king chosen by council rather than by conquest needed a hand who understood council politics, and Tyrion was at that point the only person in the room with a demonstrated track record of actually governing. Whether that argument was politically brilliant or the most convenient possible outcome for a man who needed to survive the next 10 minutes is something viewers have argued about since the finale aired. What isn't really arguable is the outcome. A former prisoner with no army and no title walked out of that gathering as Hand of the King to a monarch he had personally nominated, and a political system he had helped design from scratch.
Lord Tyrion, you will be my hand.
Lan the Clever took the castle through wit alone. 3,000 years later, his descendant took a kingdom the same way. That's Tyrion Lannister, a man who never won a fair fight in his life, never had a room of people rooting for him, and still managed to be in the room at every single critical decision point across the most consequential period in Westerosi history since Aegon's conquest. The reading, the observation, the capacity to understand people well enough to predict them, and occasionally to change them. That's the toolkit. It's not glamorous, it doesn't make for great highlight reels the way dragons and swords do, but across 12,000 years of this world's history, the people who actually shaped outcomes were almost never the ones who swung the biggest sword. If you made it this far, you're the exact kind of viewer we make these videos for, so hit that like button, and if you aren't subscribed yet, get subscribed, because we're going deep on the rest of these characters in the videos coming next. Drop in the comments, what's the one Tyrion move you think deserves more credit than it gets, because there are a few we didn't even get to.